Brilliant. Well, people are coming into the room, so I'm going to give them a few more minutes.
Sure.
But for those who are already joined, good morning, good afternoon, good evening. Thank you for joining. My name's Cliff Fawcett. I'm a director at Brandnetics, and I've got the pleasure of speaking to Gerardo Mazzeo about all things front-end innovation. Gerardo, it's great to see you again. How are you doing?
Likewise. I'm doing very well, thanks, Cliff.
Fantastic. So everyone, we've only got a brief 30 minutes together, which, trust me, isn't long enough to hear from Gerardo. So to maximize the time, let me introduce the great man, the session, how it's going to work, and we can get right into it. Gerardo is an innovator, a change agent, a transformational business leader. He has over 25 years experience in FMCG, the majority forged at Nestlé, where he held numerous senior leadership roles, including Global Innovation Director. Beyond the day job, Gerardo was a coach and mentor on front-end innovation, building excellence and nurturing market champions. He successfully launched Henry, Nestlé's first global innovation platform, and formed part of the digital acceleration team, catalyzing digital transformation across Nestlé. And this year, he's launched his own business, the Innovation Kitchen, which is making his wealth of expertise accessible beyond the walls of Nestlé. Gerardo, really looking forward to this.
Likewise. So thanks, Cliff, for that introduction.
This is Ask an Expert session. And as we've heard, we've got quite the expert with us today. But this means we want your questions. We want your involvement and engagement. So get thinking, drop some questions and comments in the chat, and we'll try and bring you on through camera to ask those questions as we go. So I'm going to kick us off. Gerardo, for you, what principle sits at the heart of successful innovation?
That's a great question to kick off with, Cliff. I think it always has to start with the consumer. And I think in our previous conversations, we talked about, asking those very simple questions. Why, what if, and what are the possibilities? And that all involves really getting underneath the skin of what is that consumer's circumstance of struggle or aspiration that we're trying to address and resolve. And I think too often we get seduced by, amazing ideas or technology without actually asking, okay, what is that going to do for the consumer? So we always have to start with that. And I know it sounds a bit cliche, but when people say, walk in the consumer shoes, that intimacy, that closeness to what tension, pain point, and aspiration, and understanding that as deeply as we can is really important. And one of the things that we strive to do in my previous role was, how do we go beyond a universal truth and really get deep in what that insight or pain point is that we're trying to resolve? And that takes time. It requires heavy lifting. It requires being where the consumer is. It means observing. It could even mean, being in their homes, cooking with them, shopping with them, to try to understand, those different missions and those different consumption moments throughout the day. So unless you start with that really well sort of furrowed area around the consumer, everything else that follows will be fragile. And there's also, especially in large organizations with the one that I was at before, there's always this tendency that you get, the knock on your office door from somebody in R&D saying, hey, Gerardo, we've got this amazing technology. It can do this, this, or this. How can we actually leverage this and make something? And And so, trying to be as polite as possible, figuring out and sort of saying, look, it's not the technology that the consumer is going to eat, swallow, or drink. We need to figure out at what stage within our innovation development will that piece of technology support and amplify the problem that we're trying to resolve.
Yeah, such a great point. And I love some of the language here around empathy, walking consumer shoes, that circumstance of struggle as well, which I haven't heard of before. Whilst everyone else is kind of getting their thinking caps in and putting their thoughts on chat, what does that really look like? Any examples? Can you bring that to life, that walking consumer shoes?
Sure. A few years ago, we were running a sort of food innovation and discovery session from one of our markets in Central America, in Dominican Republic. And one of the sort of areas that we sort of found out was that many of these households who live in certain neighborhoods have a certain amount of money to live on per day. And in this particular sort of neighborhood, the households were living on basically about $2.50 a day. And with that $2.50 a day, they had to provide breakfast, lunch, and dinner for their families. And most of these families would have 2 or 3 kids. So before we actually started the innovation workshop and the ideation, we spent about 2 days, different groups with different households, basically understanding how that $2.50 was spent, how they went about preparing a breakfast for their husbands, partners, and their children before they went off to work and school, how lunch was prepared and what ingredients were they buying, and the same for dinner as well. And it's amazing the creativity that these households and these housewives would demonstrate in how you extend, because they could only afford a certain amount of protein or meat, and what else would they add to it to bulk out the meal so that their families would feel full, that they would be satiated, and that the role of being a good housewife was amplified, because there's this tremendous feeling of, I can't get it wrong because we've only got that amount of money. So for us and for the food brands in that Central American marketplace, what do we now need to think about in providing either a partner to how they prepare their meals, whether it's breakfast, lunch, or dinner, the cues of deliciousness. We talked about, it was called meal extenders. I know it sounds very very sort of clinical and not at all appetite pill, but that in a way was what their circumstance of struggle was. I have a limited amount of money and I need to feed my family 3 times a day. So how do I ensure that I can use the right fresh ingredients, and for the amount of meat that I can afford to buy, how do I extend that? How do I make it a really good, fulfilling, delicious meal for them as well? And then as provider, they feel really well rewarded and appreciated for what they do. But you wouldn't have the richness of those insights if you didn't spend time with those families in those neighborhoods, because you just turn up, you'd go to the workshop venue, and you would start to look at some of the research that the local teams had done prior to the workshop, which has its own value, but it doesn't have the richness of go, see, do. And that's something that we talked a lot about. We would always encourage, teams to either do store visits, before we ran the innovation workshops, or to run focus groups, or to do, cooking missions in consumers' home as well, just to get an appreciation of how our products were being used and at which particular moments of the day and different consumption moments, because all of those insights help in connecting the different ideas that you would be brainstorming once the workshop began as well.
It's incredibly emotive. The power of what you just talked about there, that the tolerance, the need to be a good housewife, that circumstance of struggle. I've got Andrew Christophers here. He's got a question. I'm going to try and add him to the session so he can ask that himself. Andrew, do you want to come on camera? Let me ask it. So, here he is.
Yeah, sorry, I just...
Hi, Andrew.
Hey, Andrew.
Morning, gents, and just working out the text. Sorry for that. Lovely story about the Dominican Republic, Gerardo. Thanks so much for sharing that. My question, when you were talking earlier about new technologies and all of that, I mean, often as innovators, I think we can get to ideas that are ahead of their time. And I was just wondering if you've got any tools or tricks or experience about how to research ideas that are ahead of their time, because we often seem to face that challenge that consumers consume in the present. They know what they like now, but not necessarily what they're going to want to like in the future. So particularly if you're pursuing a more disruptive innovation agenda, I'm just wondering how you've kind of squared that circle.
Yeah, that's a great question, Andrew. I think in FMB, that's really difficult because the way that R&D, if you think about, we used to have Horizon 1, Horizon 2, Horizon 3 pipelines, and Horizon 3 would probably be 5+ years out. So they may entail things like nutritional trials, clinical trials, especially if it was in the categories of pet care, Nestle Health Science. So those would have a very different pathway of how you would research and test those, because you needed your clinical data and your trials before you could even go to market for those. And a lot of the time, the technology that R&D would come back to us with, it was either a more efficient way of producing what we already have, or we were able to do things like, so for example, in pet care, we were able to extrude hard on the inside, soft on the inside, without moisture migrating so that you would have a soggy outside, or sort of soft on the outside, but then with a hard pellet inside. So then the idea was, okay, if that's what the technology is enabling us to do, what gaps in the treating category are there where we could apply this technology and come up with really interesting propositions? And again, how we research those would be, there are a lot of us at Nestle that had dogs. So early prototypes we would bring home and just test with our dogs. Otherwise, you would do it. And I think we've become much more open to experimenting and placing small bets. So not going for the really expensive STM or bases, but finding a panel of consumers, 30, 40, 50, whatever it might be, that would take those products in or propositions, and over a period of time, test them for us, and then we'd get some data. We've also experimented with using sort of, say, 10 to 15 retail stores where a fully finished prototype with the right barcode, SKU count would be placed in those stores, and we could monitor, rate of sale, repeat, distribution, all of those things. So you're getting, I would say, real market data in a particular area that could be used as metrics for the next stage of your development and stuff. And about 3-4 years ago now, R&D launched an accelerator program in Lausanne at their center. And that's another vehicle of researching and testing ideas, which may be Horizon 2 or Horizon 3 as well. So you're starting to get early stage diagnostics ready to, bring back to the business. And I think a learning for us anyway, especially when we launched Henry and with the R&D accelerator, is you've got to get the business involved at the earliest possible stage, because there's no point, after you've done all of this work, you start knocking on the doors of your, business unit partners, and trying to sell the proposition. You need to be fully aligned with what's their strategic direction, what are their swim lanes that they're focusing on, and more importantly, the strategic swim lanes, so that you can already start to work on opportunity areas that would meet and fulfill their operational needs. Because otherwise you're just going to get a polite no thanks, because they've got so many other challenges in meeting their monthly, quarterly, half yearly and yearly business targets, that unless you get them bought in at the brief stage, it's very, very hard, especially in an organization of the size and complexity of Nestle. Does that answer your question?
It does. Thanks. I'll slip off. Leave the rest.
Thanks, Andrew. And amazing. Yeah, I think that importance of aligning the business and then getting that sense of experimentation, testing and learning. Got a question here from Suzette. Suzette, do you want to join us on video? Let me ask the question then. How do you convince your leadership of an innovation that may address a value that customers don't know they have yet?
And by customers, Suzette, I'm assuming you mean consumers in this sense, because consumers and customers can have dual meaning. So again, a brilliant question. I think some of the examples I've given before about test and learn, placing small bets, experimenting with that, and demonstrating to the business and the leadership of those business units that there is traction, is probably one of the ways that we were able to demonstrate that we actually have a proposition that could win out in the marketplace. The other thing I always go back to is what I was just saying briefly with Andrew, getting the business bought in at the brief stage is really, really important, because otherwise it's just hard selling that in much further down. And if they have ownership in what you're trying to do to help them with their 2, 3, 5-year operational plan, you have a much better partnership set up than you do if you were going 6 months down the line knocking on everybody's door. So I hope that answers your question, Suzette.
That's great. Thanks, Gerardo. Yeah, Suzette's all thumbs up. Jose's got a question here about how do we split innovation and marginal improvements? Jose, feel free to jump on camera if you want to add anything to that.
So I'm assuming, Jose, that when you use the term marginal improvements, I'm assuming that means renovation. So for us, there were two very different areas. Renovation is what you have to do day in, day out on your brands, and that would occupy 95% of the team's time. So new recipe formulation, better ingredients, packaging improvements, the dimension of, say, sustainability and all sorts. And the innovation bit would probably represent 5% plus. And you would have, depending on which brand team or category team, the brand team, renovation would be one of their core responsibilities. Innovation could be driven by, and we've done different models at Nestle over the years, but let's just assume there was an innovation manager, let's say in pet care, and let's say it was on the dog category, and within that it was on the treating or the biscuits category. So that individual would be responsible for driving innovation, and they would have metrics and KPIs that they would be measured against to drive that particular pathway. So does that answer your question as well? And again, whenever we used to write the 3-year operational plans, you would have a section on innovation, and there would be your map of year 1 all the way to year 3 for your innovation candidates against the different growth platforms and the different consumer circumstances of struggles that you were trying to resolve. And then there would be renovation projects. And all of those would marry up to a value, and that would give you what your 3-year business plan would look like if you achieved successful execution and implementation of those renovation and innovation projects.
That's brilliant. Thanks, Gerardo. And yeah, and again, big thumbs up from Jose. You mentioned sustainability there, and James has actually got a question here about food waste, climate justice. James, would you like to jump on camera and talk more about this? Brilliant. James, just come in. Let me just add him to the session. I think technology is just catching up. So let me read through what James has said, and he can add to it as he joins. So with food waste and climate justice, global village mentality seemingly being major trends that will influence the production and consumption of food in future, what are the innovations you're hoping to see that might radically revamp our relationship with food based on your experience?
That's a great question, James, and a very broad question as well. Let me just start with some of the developments that I've seen in, let's say, the alternative dairy, alternative protein categories, because in a way we have to make sure that those categories succeed, whether that's greater product integrity, pricing being more matched to dairy or meat, and because obviously our reliance on, there's not enough arable land for us to have the livestock on there as well. So, I've seen great innovations in those areas as well. On top of that, I'm seeing a much greater scrutiny on packaging and the amount of packaging to be used as well. And within food, one of the things that we looked at was, how do you create sort of meal partnerships where you're using fresh vegetables as a partner to the products that we were making as well. How to give greater guidance on portionability, portion guidance, and all of those things as well. It's very broad, James. I mean, I'm probably not treating it with the same degree as you're expecting, but I hope that just gives you a flavor of what I've started to see. One of the other things that we also worked on a lot was what we call beyond the label. So making consumers understand where your product comes from, where the ingredients are grown, how it was made as well. So a greater transparency, from field to table, and really understanding all of those steps in there as well. Because I think a lot of consumers simply don't understand or know where your food comes from. And I really like how brands today, not just the ones at Nestle, but within this category, are doing a great job around storytelling. And so I think that's only going to improve. And I think packaging and the materials that are being used to drive greater recyclability, reuse, and moving away from single use is getting better all the time.
Yeah, super encouraging, Gerardo. Thanks so much. And it's lovely to think that there are at least signs and signals that positive change is going to happen.
Yes. Thanks, James.
Brilliant. Thanks, James.
See you later. Thanks, Cliff.
Thanks. So we're coming up to our final 5 minutes. Please get any final questions in there. Join us on video if you've got something you want to throw in. While you're thinking, a question I've got, Gerardo, how do you break the inertia of big corporates when it comes to innovation?
Again, that's a brilliant question, because I think, like all human beings, whether you're in a corporate or not, we're very resistant to change. And it requires a tremendous amount of effort to overcome that change, because people naturally feel threatened by change, whether that's a new service proposition, a new product proposition, a new way of doing business, that they do feel threatened. And I experienced a lot of that friction and that aversion to change. I think you just need to make unfamiliar ideas or new routes feel as familiar as you can to them. So that's always about demonstrating, what is the size of the prize and why this particular approach is going to be really important for that business category or brand. I think there's lather, rinse and repeat and do it again. Keep re-informing them that this is not, it's not a challenge to what they've been doing, but it's actually going to amplify and build their business for the future as well. And that connects back to what I said before, which is, if you get the business involved with their specific challenge right at the very beginning, when you're constructing and crafting the brief, and you get that buy-in, it's much easier then to sort of push through the treacle of inertia that you get in these in these corporates. The other thing as well is, and by doing that, those ideas and that innovation swim lane has a route to implementation as well. That's really important. At any one point in time, there are hundreds, if not thousands, of innovation projects happening at any one stage. And what you need to make sure is, how are we going to land these, and once we land them, what is the impact that's going to have, the positive impact to that business or category. And sometimes, the inertia is not so much that they don't like the idea or proposition. It's just that there may be some roadblocks in the way. So our job as innovators internally was, how do we remove some of those, those roadblocks or those stickiness in it as well. So that's what I've learned. I mean, but ultimately you're always going to get this, initial inertia, and it's all about, I think Marie said this morning on the session with Tom, communication, and getting that buy-in as early as you can, and showing what it means for their business and the future of their business as well, because everybody wants to grow their business or brand. And if you can demonstrate that, it's a much easier partnership and collaboration process.
I think that's lovely. And as you say, the earlier you can learn where the business is going, align that, communicate, you reduce that inertia.
Yes.
We've got just a few minutes left. Please, any final questions, throw them in. But one thought that you just sparked there, you talked about roadblocks. What are some of the biggest challenges or roadblocks when it comes to food and drink innovation specifically?
One of the most common phrases, we did that a few years ago and it didn't work. And that's just their polite way of saying, I don't believe in what you're trying to do, and stuff. Other roadblocks might be, we don't have the resources, we don't have the priorities. Oh, we can't launch it in year one. Maybe we should table it for year 3. And this is the other challenge, that if it's constantly being pushed out, by the time it lands on the shelf, you're entering a category or subcategory that's already saturated by lots and lots of other players. So you're always going to be playing catch up. So there is this degree of urgency and trying to push, especially if you've come up with a really insightful way to resolve that consumer's circumstance of struggle. Otherwise, you're always going to be trying to convince the trade then why you should be listed alongside the other 10 or 15 similar products on the shelf as well. Other times it's, okay, why don't we pilot it in country XYZ or whatever, and that they're only doing that because it's away from their core markets and stuff. But that's not where we should be testing it. We want to be testing it in the market with the best potential, and therefore the best growth and profitability dimension to that as well.
Of course. just the importance of agility and speed, right?
Yeah.
In that as well.
Yeah, and I think Marie this morning from AB and Bev talked, her definition of agility was perseverance with experimentation, which is a beautiful way of defining it, because that's exactly what you need. You need that perseverance. You need that resilience as an innovator within, you know, a big corporate, because in matrix-led organizations, you're you're a bit like, you know, minister without portfolio. So you're having to convince, you're having to inspire, you're having to demonstrate what will the world of food look like in 3 to 5 years time. So again, we go back to the consumer intimacy. We go back to, and one of the reasons why we used to take Henry out on the road to all of these startup events is that we were starting to see what the world of food tech could look like in 3 to 5 years time. And that's the sort of the canvas that you want to bring back to head office and start to inspire and motivate them, and then figure out how does that relate to pet care, coffee, water, confectionery, etc., etc.
Gerardo, that has been a fascinating way to spend 30 minutes. Really inspiring.
Thanks,
Thank you.
Cliff.
Thank you for all your questions and engagement, everybody. And enjoy the rest of the day.
Thanks very much. Take care, Cliff.
Thanks. Thanks, Gerardo.
Bye-bye.